Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Mirror's Reflection. Isabella had always been a creature of routine. She was a woman of habits, a life structured around predictability. Her mornings were spent in the quiet solitude of her apartment, coffee brewing, sunlight streaming in through the windows, and her reflection greeting her as she adjusted her hair and clothes in the hallway mirror. It was comforting, like a companion that had always been there, never changing. But that comfort would soon be shattered in ways she could never have imagined. It all began one evening, after Isabella had returned from a long day at work. She was exhausted, eager to unwind in her cozy apartment. She set her keys down on the counter and made her way to the bathroom. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the otherwise quiet space. When she turned on the bathroom light and caught sight of herself in the mirror, she didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. At first, as usual, she was adjusting her blouse, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. But then something caught her eye. In the reflection, her hand moved too slowly. It lingered in place for a split second longer than it should have, and then it continued, as if her reflection had been delayed. Isabella froze, staring at her own image in confusion. She slowly reached up again, this time her fingers brushing against the skin of her cheek, and her reflection didn't move. Her reflection stood still, eyes wide, mirroring her every motion. Until it didn't. Isabella blinked, then rubbed her eyes, thinking she was just tired. But when she looked back, the reflection didn't mimic her this time. It smiled, a chilling, wide grin that stretched unnaturally across the mirrored version of her face. The reflection's eyes glinted with something cold and malicious. She staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't tired, nor had she been drinking. It was real. What are you? Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. Her reflection smiled even wider. But then, something far more disturbing happened. It started moving on its own. While Isabella stood frozen in horror, her reflection tilted its head, as if studying her with a curiosity she had never seen in herself. It mirrored her gestures at first, raising a hand to its cheek, but with an eerie slowness. Then, as if sensing her unease, it tilted its head even more, grinning wider, and slowly began to step out of the frame of the mirror. Isabella gasped and stumbled backward. Her hands fumbled for the bathroom door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had jammed. With a sinking feeling, she realized she couldn't escape. Her reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something that wanted to be free. She backed away from the mirror, eyes locked onto the horrifying scene in front of her. The reflection was inching forward, its movements slow but deliberate, its grin never fading. Isabella felt as though she was being drawn into the mirror. Its coldness seeped through the glass like a phantom touch. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but no sound came. It was as if the world around her had silenced itself, leaving her alone in this nightmare with her other self. The reflection's hand slowly reached for the mirror's edge, its fingers stretching. But they weren't just reflections anymore. They were real, solid. And just as its hand passed through the surface of the mirror, Isabella screamed. The reflection laughed. No, it giggled. a high-pitched, mocking sound that made her blood run cold. Its hand gripped the edge of the mirror, and with terrifying strength, it began pulling itself out of the glass, its form contorting unnaturally as it stepped into the room. Isabella tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, her body trembling as she stared at the twisted version of herself now standing in front of her. The creature was her, but not her at all. It was wrong, its eyes too wide, its smile too thin. It was hungry. It leaned in close to her, its breath hot on her skin. "Do you want to know what it feels like? To be free?" It whispered, its voice deep, almost mocking. "To be the one who controls, the one who isn't bound by the glass." The reflection took a slow, deliberate step toward her, and Isabella could feel the air around her growing colder, darker. She tried to speak, to beg, but no words came. She was caught, trapped in her own horror. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, as though something had pierced her. But when she looked down, there was nothing there. The pain intensified, and Isabella's body jerked as though yanked by some unseen force. She gasped for breath, trying to break free of the invisible strings that bound her. And then, through the agony, she saw it. The reflection grinning wildly, its own body writhing as though it were alive and feeding off her fear. "Do you feel it?" the reflection hissed. "The strings that tie you to this world. They're mine now." The last thing Isabella saw before everything went black was her reflection stepping out of the mirror fully, its eyes shining with malicious triumph. She woke up in the hospital hours later, her body stiff and sore. A nurse stood by her bed, and doctors hovered nearby, whispering urgently. Isabella's mind raced. What happened? How did she get here? The nurse smiled at her, but there was something odd about her expression. "You're awake. We were worried for a moment," the nurse said, her voice oddly distant. "You had quite the experience, didn't you?" Isabella looked around, her mind spinning, still haunted by the nightmare. What happened? How did I get here?" The nurse's smile grew even wider. "You've been under observation for a while, but don't worry, you're safe now." Suddenly, Isabella's eyes darted toward the mirror on the opposite wall. It was small, framed with gold, and catching the faint light from the room. Her heart stopped. Her reflection, her other self, was staring back at her, the same malicious grin stretched across its face. And just before the nurse spoke again, Isabella could swear she saw the reflection in the mirror wink. The screen cuts to black. Text appears. Has Isabella truly escaped? Or is the reflection still watching, waiting for the perfect moment to take her place? Story 2. The Shadow on the Stairs. The house was old, too old for comfort. Its creaky floorboards and drafts that whispered through the walls made Emily feel like she was living in a place that had long forgotten its purpose. But she had moved in anyway. It was cheap, and she needed the space. The small cottage on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect escape from her chaotic life. She didn't mind the darkness that clung to the corners, the thick air that never seemed to leave, or the way the shadows always looked just a little too sharp, too alive. At first, Emily thought she was just being paranoid. The house's age, the solitude, it was all getting to her. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Every night, around the same time, she would hear it. A soft creak, then another. It would start from the bottom of the stairs. But as the sound grew louder, more deliberate, she began to feel it in her bones. The unmistakable sensation that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was waiting for her. She would lie awake in her bed, listening, her heart thudding in her chest. Each creak of the stairs sent a cold shiver down her spine, and each time the sound would get closer. Step by agonizing step, the figure moved upward, ever so slowly, as if savoring the fear it was causing. And every time, she would pull the blanket over her head, trying to block out the sound, telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. One night, unable to sleep, she decided to confront the noise. She lay still for a while, waiting. The house seemed unusually quiet. Then, just as she began to relax, she heard it. Creak, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slowly, methodically, they climbed. Her pulse quickened. The air grew thick with dread, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. She tried to convince herself it was just the house settling again. But this time, there was something different, something wrong. The footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful, and the darkness around her seemed to thicken, stretching like ink around the edges of the room. Creak, her eyes shot open. A shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, just out of view. It was tall, unnaturally so, its edges sharp and undefined, as though it were made of darkness itself. It stood there, motionless, staring at her with an emptiness that sent a chill through her entire body. Emily couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen, trapped in some invisible grip. The shadow started moving again, climbing higher, step by agonizing step. Emily wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed, her eyes locked onto the shadow as it ascended. Each step it took seemed to draw it closer to her, like a silent predator creeping toward its prey. She could almost hear its breath, low and raspy, as if it were savoring her terror. The air grew heavier, colder, as the figure neared her door. Emily's mind raced. What was it? Who was it? Why was it coming for her? The shadow reached the top of the stairs, its form now completely obscured by the darkness. Emily's pulse hammered in her chest, and she could feel the sweat on her palms as she gripped the edge of the bed, willing herself to move. Then, just as it should have reached her door, the footsteps stopped. Silence. The tension in the room was unbearable. Emily didn't dare breathe. Her eyes were wide, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, no creaks, no sounds, just the suffocating silence. But then thump, the door to her bedroom rattled, as if something heavy had slammed into it from the other side. The shadow on the stairs had moved again. Suddenly, Emily's body sprang into action. She rushed to the door, throwing the bolt and pressing her back against it. Her heart raced, and every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, to escape. But she knew, deep down, that there was no escaping what was coming for her. Thump. The door shuddered again, this time harder, as if the figure on the stairs was testing its strength. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her. Emily tried to call out for help, but no words came. Her throat was dry, and her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The shadow at the top of the stairs had moved, inching closer to her room. She could hear it now, its slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing in her ears, growing louder with every passing second. It was close, so close. And then, just as she thought it couldn't get any worse, the doorknob turned. Her blood ran cold. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle on her nightstand. The room plunged into darkness, but Emily could still hear the figure. The heavy footsteps were unmistakable, drawing closer and closer. She could feel the heat of its presence, but she couldn't see it. And then, just as the shadow was almost upon her, its cold breath brushing against her neck. A voice whispered in her ear, so soft, so cold, "You can't escape me." Emily screamed, but before the sound could escape her lips, everything went black. The next morning, the sun was shining through the window, and Emily awoke with a start. Her heart raced in her chest, and her body was covered in a cold sweat. She looked around the room, half expecting to see the shadow still lurking in the corners, waiting for nightfall. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the morning. Emily breathed a sigh of relief. It had to have been a nightmare. She was just overtired, her mind playing tricks on her. But as she stood up and moved toward the window, she froze. The stairs, the bottom of the stairs, just outside her room. A dark figure stood there, frozen, unmoving, staring. Its eyes gleamed in the shadow, and for the first time, Emily realized the truth. It wasn't a dream, and it was never going away. The screen cuts to black. Text appears. Will Emily survive the relentless pursuit of the shadow, or will it claim her before the next nightfall? Story 3. The Candle's Flame. The candle sat in an old, dust-covered shop, nestled between other strange trinkets and artifacts. Its wax was dark, almost black, and the wick had a faint glow to it, as though it were already alive. It was unlike any other candle Clara had ever seen. The shopkeeper, an old man with eyes that seemed to carry centuries of secrets, had warned her not to touch it. "That candle," he had said, his voice low and almost reverent, "is not for the faint of heart." But Clara, intrigued by the aura of mystery that surrounded the candle, couldn't resist. She had always been drawn to the peculiar, the things others dismissed as mere superstition. The old man had insisted it would bring only disaster, but Clara, convinced he was just trying to protect his wares, bought it. She couldn't understand the unease in his voice, the way he spoke of it as if it were something alive. When she got home, she placed the candle on her dining table, studying it with fascination. The wax was smooth but with veins of deep red running through it, as if something, or someone, had bled into it. The wick was dark, yet it seemed to beckon her, almost alive in the way it swayed ever so slightly, despite the lack of wind. Clara's hand hovered over it. What could possibly happen? She thought. It's just a candle. With a quick motion, she struck a match and lit the wick. The flame flickered to life immediately, but it was not like any flame she had ever seen. It was dark, shifting in shades of deep red and black, casting shadows that moved independently of the light. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural weight. The silence in the room became deafening, and Clara could feel the walls closing in around her. A strange sensation washed over her, like she was no longer alone in the room. Suddenly, the room seemed to distort. The walls stretched and bent, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The candle's flame burned brighter, growing larger, until it was no longer a mere light, but an overwhelming force, consuming the room. It was as if the flame was pulling everything into it, reality itself twisting, unraveling, and warping around her. Clara tried to blow out the candle, but no matter how hard she tried, the flame only grew stronger, larger, its light now blinding. She stumbled back, heart pounding in her chest, but her body was moving of its own accord, dragged by some invisible force. The room around her disappeared completely, replaced by an endless dark expanse, a void of blackness. The candle, however, was still there, its flame now a massive inferno, casting grotesque, distorted shadows that danced on the walls of an unknown landscape. Clara was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms vague and shifting, like nightmares brought to life. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to make Clara's blood run cold. The air grew heavy, and the scent of smoke and decay filled her lungs. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figures drew closer, their hollow eyes locked on her, each step they took causing her to tremble more. One figure, taller than the others, stepped forward. It was cloaked in shadow, its face hidden in the folds of its dark robes. Its voice, when it spoke, was not a sound but a feeling, a coldness that seeped into her bones. "You have lit the candle," it said, its voice a low growl that reverberated in her chest. "Now, you belong to it. You cannot escape." Clara tried to scream, but no sound came. She fought against the pull, trying to break free from whatever dark grip had taken hold of her. Her limbs were heavy, her body unwilling to obey. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just the overwhelming presence of the candle's curse. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and spindly. As it touched her, her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the flame, her body becoming weightless, disintegrating into smoke and shadow. And then everything stopped. Clara found herself standing in the same room she had started in. The candle was still burning, its flame dark and unyielding, but the air was thick with the same oppressive force. The room had returned to normal, yet it felt different, empty, as though she had never truly been in control of her surroundings. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered in the corners of her mind. She felt their eyes on her, felt the burn of the flame behind her. The terror was not over. The candle's curse had not released her. In a panic, Clara tried to blow it out again, but the flame wouldn't be extinguished. Instead, it flickered, growing larger with every breath she took. The shadows in the room began to stretch again, as if the flame was pulling the world into its grip. And that's when she realized the nightmare had already begun. Every time she tried to escape, the candle would burn brighter, the darkness would return, and the figures would come closer. The nightmare was not a one-time event. It was endless. The candle had no end, and neither did her torment. The cursed candle burned forever, and Clara knew, with an overwhelming sense of despair, that she would never escape its flame. Each time she thought she had broken free, it would pull her back in, deeper and deeper, into the nightmare that had no escape. Forever trapped, forever bound to the flame. As the candle's flame flickered, Clara's heartbeat echoed in her chest. She had tried to push it out of her mind, tried to convince herself that the nightmare she had just experienced was some kind of hallucination or fevered dream. But when she opened her eyes, she was still in the same room, the same suffocating, oppressive space. The candle sat there, unmoving, but its presence was more terrifying than ever. The walls of her apartment were no longer the familiar beige and white of her cozy home. They were cold and dark, streaked with shadows that didn't belong. The air tasted metallic, thick with the scent of something burning. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through the floorboards and into her bones. She felt trapped, as though the room itself was no longer just a room, but a living thing, a monster with its own pulse and hunger. Clara stumbled back toward the door, her feet dragging like lead. She reached for the knob, her fingers trembling as they touched the cold metal. She twisted it. It wouldn't budge. The door was sealed, locked by some unseen force. Panic set in again, and she turned, her eyes darting around the room. The figures had returned, more numerous this time. They had come in from the corners. emerging from the darkness that seemed to spill from the walls themselves. They circled her, moving slowly, their shadowy forms constantly shifting, never staying still. Their eyes, hollow and glowing faintly, never left her. They didn't speak, but Clara could hear them. She could hear their thoughts, their hunger, their craving for something she didn't fully understand. The feeling was suffocating, as though their mere presence was draining the life from her. And in the center of the room, the cursed candle continued to burn. Clara's mind raced. She had to get out. There must be a way out. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her. She reached for the window, but as she tried to open it, she found that it, too, was sealed, frozen shut, as if the room itself had swallowed the outside world whole. She pounded on the glass, but it didn't give way. Her chest tightened with each breath she took. It was happening again. She had been pulled back into the nightmare, trapped in the very place she had tried to escape from. Then, as if in response to her desperation, the air grew colder. The figures grew closer, their cold breath washing over her like a suffocating wave. One step forward, closer than the others, its movements deliberate, slow, as if savoring her fear. This one was different. It was taller, its cloak swirling around it like smoke. Its face, though hidden beneath the hood, seemed to emit an aura of malevolence that chilled Clara to her core. And when it spoke, its voice was not like the others. It was deeper, almost ancient, and it echoed in her mind. "You lit the candle," it said, its voice low and dripping with malice. "Now you belong to us." Clara recoiled, but the figure's hand shot out, gripping her wrist in an iron-like grasp. The coldness of its touch sent a shock of terror through her, as if the very essence of her being was being drained away. She gasped for breath, her body trembling. She tried to pull free, but the figure's grip was unrelenting, and with a terrifying sense of inevitability, it began to pull her toward the candle. "No, please," Clara cried, her voice barely a whisper as she struggled against the dark figure. "I don't want this. Please, I just want to go home." But the figure said nothing. It only tilted its head slightly, as though watching her futile attempts with amusement. The other figures remained silent, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she was drawn closer to the flame. The air around her grew hotter, heavier, and the light from the candle warped and shifted, stretching out into an unnatural, elongated glow. The shadows seemed to grow sharper, more defined, as if they were alive, ready to devour her. When she reached the candle, the room around her seemed to warp and twist, the walls and floor bending in impossible angles. It was like she was being sucked into the flame itself, as if it was a portal to another world, a dark and twisted place. She fought back with every ounce of strength, but it was no use. Her body moved against her will, drawn inexorably toward the cursed flame. As she neared the candle, she could hear a whisper. No, 1,000 whispers, rising in a chorus, filling the room with a terrifying cacophony. The voices, twisted and corrupted, spoke of torment, of pain, of a never-ending abyss. "You will never escape. We own you. You are ours now." Clara screamed, but her voice was lost in the chorus of madness. Her hand reached out, as though on its own, drawn toward the flame. She closed her eyes, bracing for whatever was to come. But instead of burning, she felt nothing. A strange numbness overtook her, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the room at all. The world she found herself in was darker than the deepest night, a void stretching endlessly in every direction, filled with nothing but shadows and cold. The flame of the candle flickered in the distance, far away, but never out of reach. Clara stood in the center of this void, paralyzed, her mind racing with the horrifying realization that she was no longer in her apartment. She was trapped in the candle's world. The shadows around her shifted, moving closer, their forms swirling and coiling like smoke from a fire. Clara tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Every direction she turned led her back to the same spot, to the same endless blackness, with the faint, flickering light of the cursed candle never more than a shadow's distance away. The whispers started again, closer now, surrounding her. You will never leave. The candle's curse is eternal, forever bound, forever ours. Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she realized the terrifying truth. The candle did not just burn forever. It was a prison, and she was its prisoner. She was now part of the flame, part of the nightmare. And as long as the candle burned, she would never be free. The flame continued to flicker, casting long, distorted shadows over the endless void, the whispers of the cursed growing louder with each passing moment. The nightmare had only just begun. Story 4. The Dollhouse. Lily had always been a curious child. Her house, an old Victorian with creaking floorboards and narrow hallways, was a place that always seemed to hide something. An antique clock that had stopped ticking, a mirror that reflected things not quite right, and windows that rattled on windy nights. But to Lily, it wasn't a house full of mysteries. It was simply home. That was, until one fateful afternoon when her world would change forever. She had been exploring the attic when she stumbled upon it, hidden beneath a dusty sheet, half obscured by the shadows of forgotten boxes and old furniture. It was a dollhouse, a perfect miniature replica of her home. It was so detailed that at first, Lily thought it was a model of the house, something her parents had made for her as a gift. But no, the walls of the dollhouse were too fine, the furniture too intricate. It looked alive in a way that unsettled her. Lily's fingers trembled as she reached out, her small hands brushing against the smooth, polished wood. She gently lifted the sheet off, revealing the dollhouse in all its glory. It was an exact replica of her home. Every room, every hallway, every piece of furniture meticulously recreated in the tiny space. But what made it even more unsettling was the fact that the house wasn't empty. There were tiny dolls inside, standing in the rooms, their glassy eyes staring blankly into space. Lily picked up one of the dolls, inspecting it carefully. It was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and its face was frozen in a perpetual expression of surprise. She shivered, a sudden sense of unease creeping up her spine. Why would anyone make something so lifelike? Why did it feel like the dolls were watching her? Despite the unsettling feeling in her stomach, Lily couldn't resist the pull of the dollhouse. She began to rearrange the furniture in the tiny rooms, moving chairs, tables, and dolls. As she shifted a little wooden chair from the living room to the kitchen, she heard a soft creak from downstairs. It was so faint she almost didn't hear it. But there it was again, creak, coming from the exact place where the chair had been. Confused, Lily stood up and walked down the stairs. She opened the door to the living room and froze. The chair she had just moved in the dollhouse was now sitting in the exact same spot in the real living room. Lily's heart began to race. No, it couldn't be. She must have just imagined it. She must have been tired, her mind playing tricks on her. But as she walked closer to the chair, her pulse quickened. The chair was exactly where it had been in the dollhouse. too perfectly aligned to be a coincidence. Her legs trembled beneath her, but Lily refused to believe what her mind was suggesting. There had to be an explanation, a logical one. She returned to the attic and approached the dollhouse again, her eyes scanning it for any clue, any reason why the furniture in her home would change, just like the miniature version. She reached out again, her fingers trembling as she touched the little wooden table in the dining room of the dollhouse. The second her fingers made contact, the lights in the house flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Lily's heart stopped. The sound had come from the kitchen. She slowly walked down the stairs, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The kitchen light flickered erratically, and when she entered, her blood ran cold. The table in the real kitchen had been moved. It was now positioned exactly where it had been in the dollhouse. The chairs were arranged differently, too. A strange, cold chill filled the room. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. Her hands shook as she tried to reach for her phone to call her parents. But when she looked down, the phone screen was cracked, the image of her parents distorted. She dropped it, backing away from the kitchen, her body frozen with fear. She turned back toward the stairs, hearing the familiar creak of the floorboards behind her. But as she looked up, her eyes widened. The hallway was different, no longer the familiar space she had known. The wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark, decaying wood beneath. The air smelled musty and cold, and the walls seemed to stretch and groan as though the house itself was alive, twisting, shifting. Lily rushed back to the attic, desperate to escape the growing dread. She stood in front of the dollhouse, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of it all. Was it the house? Was it the dollhouse? Or was it something else entirely? In a panic, she grabbed the dollhouse, intending to throw it away, to get rid of whatever curse it had placed on her home. But as soon as her fingers touched the dollhouse, the lights flickered once again, and the house began to hum, low, vibrating, almost like it was breathing. And then the dolls moved. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched them, tiny, lifeless figures, begin to move on their own. The doll in the living room stood up, its eyes wide, and it turned its head toward her, its mouth opening slightly. The others followed suit, each one rising, stepping slowly toward the front door of the dollhouse. Lily stumbled backward, dropping the dollhouse. The tiny figures inside began to move faster, jerking toward the door, as if they were trying to escape. The house trembled in her hands, and she screamed, pushing it away from her. That's when she heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from the dollhouse. "You can't change what's already done." The voice was not human, its tone dark and twisted. It reverberated through Lily's bones, causing her to clutch her head in pain. Her vision blurred, and her knees buckled beneath her. The room around her began to spin, as though the house itself was folding in on her, suffocating her. She barely registered the sound of footsteps, soft, shuffling steps, coming from the hallway. The dolls, they had left the house. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Lily turned, her breath shallow, her heart racing. She stumbled toward the door, but before she could reach it, a shadow passed across the wall, tall and looming. She looked up, and her blood ran cold. Standing at the top of the stairs was a figure, its face obscured by shadows, its body misshapen, twisted. Its eyes gleamed with a hunger that sent terror coursing through her veins. "Welcome home," it whispered, its voice raspy like gravel scraping against stone. Lily turned and bolted for the door, but as her hand touched the handle, it twisted on its own. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient, something hungry. And then, just before she could break free, the house screamed. The ground beneath her feet shook violently as the house seemed to collapse inward, the walls bending and distorting like a living thing. The dolls, now scattered throughout the house, began to move faster, more frantically. Their eyes no longer looked like lifeless glass. They glowed with an unnatural light, their once doll faces twisted into grotesque expressions. Lily was trapped. The shadow at the top of the stairs moved forward, its form becoming clearer. It was no longer just a figure, it was a thing, a creature, and it was coming for her. With one final scream, the house collapsed around her. The last thing she saw was the dollhouse, its doors wide open, as if waiting to swallow her whole. The screen fades to black. Text appears. The dollhouse awaits its next occupant. Will Lily ever escape, or has the house claimed her soul? If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know, you might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.